Hello my friends, I want to welcome you to our channel, which will help you fall asleep easily and with benefit. Share with us where you're watching from right now and what time it is for you. And while you're writing, I'll begin. Welcome to our channel, where bygone eras delicately unveiled their secrets through tales, legends, and little-known details. Allow the chronicle to gently immerse you in slumber. And if you enjoy this journey, stay with us, subscribe, and mark it as liked, so that the voice of history may sound for you again and again. Close your eyes. We are setting off on a journey through the centuries. The end of the First World War left the German Empire in deep decline. Although its lands hardly knew foreign invasion, the conditions set by the victorious powers were perceived as a national insult. The peace treaty, signed in June 1919, forced Germany to admit guilt for starting the war, cede territory, reduce its military forces to a minimum, and pay unaffordable reparations. In November 1918, the former government fell. Unrest began with uprisings in the northern ports, where sailors and workers revolted. This led to the Kaiser's abdication and flight. The monarchy was replaced by a provisional republic led by Social Democrats, who tried to maintain control amid growing chaos. This republic, known as the Weimar Republic, took its name from the constitution adopted in the city of Weimar. From its inception, it faced resistance from various groups. The military, monarchists, and right-wing politicians did not recognize its legitimacy. For them, the capitulation and signing of peace were acts of betrayal. They spread the myth that the German army had not been defeated on the battlefield, but had been stabbed in the back by politicians. This myth became popular among nationalists and was long used to discredit the new order. The country's economy was in a catastrophic state. The war had depleted finances, leaving a huge debt. In an effort to meet obligations to the victors, the authorities launched unlimited money printing, which caused hyperinflation. By 1923, the value of the mark became negligible. Wages devalued within hours. Buying the bare necessities, such as bread, became a race against time. Savings disappeared in days. Desperation gripped society. In this environment, armed groups of various orientations began to emerge. Communists sought to repeat the Russian experience and in a number of cities tried to seize power. At the same time, former military men created right-wing volunteer units, which broke up rallies and dealt with left-wing activists. One such well-known organization was the Freikorps, consisting of veterans who despised democracy and dreamed of reviving the empire. The streets became an arena of clashes. There were murders, attacks, and rebellions. Ministers, judges, trade union leaders, and entrepreneurs became targets. Against this backdrop, many began to nostalgically recall the times of the former empire. For them, the Republic was associated only with chaos and instability, and there were reasons for that. According to the treaty, the army was reduced to 100,000 men, which was insufficient even to guard the borders. The police could not maintain order. In many regions, real power was wielded by armed groups or local rulers. The state seemed weak and ineffective. The new political system, based on universal suffrage, parliament, and modern norms, worked poorly. Multiple parties could not form a stable majority, and governments were short-lived. The population saw that democracy did not solve urgent problems. The victorious powers did not ease the pressure. Foreign troops occupied some territories, for example, the Ruhr region, monitoring Germany's compliance with the treaty terms. This caused a rise in outrage. The right-wing press used these facts, speaking of national humiliation and betrayal. In this atmosphere, groups previously considered marginal began to gain influence. Their radical ideas began to resonate. They preached nationalism, anti-Semitism, the need for strong power, and the revival of national dignity. One such organization was the German Workers' Party, small but active. It gathered in beer halls, where its members discussed ways to revive the country. A former soldier, Adolf Hitler, came to one such meeting. He had no significant successes at the front, but possessed oratorical skills and the ability to influence an audience. The party leadership noticed him, and soon he became the main agitator. His speeches combined hatred, accusations, and promises of retribution. He claimed that Jews, communists, and politicians had destroyed Germany, and many believed him. Later, this small group changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party. It was still small in number, but the ground for its growth had been prepared. The Republic could ensure neither order nor food security. People were afraid and sought simple answers. Among the ruins of the post-war years, a movement began to gain strength that was destined to change history. National Socialism was born. After the chaos of the first post-war years, the German Workers' Party was just one of many small groups that emerged in Munich. By the end of 1919, it had no more than 50 members. Its goal was to attract workers disillusioned with both Marxism and the traditional political system. One of its members became Adolf Hitler, a former soldier sent by the army to observe extremist movements. Hitler first attended a party meeting in September of that year. He entered into a debate with one of the speakers and attracted attention. The organization's leader, Anton Drexler, invited him to join. Hitler agreed. He was a man without a permanent occupation, education, or family, but possessed a gift for public speaking, which soon became his main weapon. In 1920, the party changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party. It was still small, but the ground for its growth was prepared. It was a peculiar mixture of nationalist and social ideas. The name was intended to attract both workers and patriots, including war veterans. As a symbol, a black swastika on a red and white background was chosen, reminiscent of the colors of the former empire. At the same time, a 25-point program was published. It included demands for the unification of all Germans, the abolition of the Treaty of Versailles, the expansion of living space, the restriction of immigration, and the expulsion of Jews. The party advocated for a strong state, free from corruption, an independent press, and foreign capital. The ideology combined anti-Semitism, racism, and authoritarianism with populist slogans. The group remained small but gradually gained notoriety in Munich. Hitler became its main speaker, filling beer halls. He criticized communists, Jews, politicians, and entrepreneurs, promising to restore pride, punish traitors, and save the fatherland. His style was aggressive and theatrical. He used facial expressions, voice, and gestures to emotionally influence the audience. In 1921, Hitler established complete control over the party, eliminating internal rivals and demanding unquestioning obedience. To protect meetings and disrupt competitors' events, he created a paramilitary wing, the Sturmabteilung stormtroopers. Their members, dressed in brown uniforms, acted as shock troops, beating political opponents and participating in street clashes. Many of them were unemployed veterans seeking activity. For them, the party became a way to continue the struggle. Hitler used the SA to demonstrate strength and create an atmosphere of fear. At the same time, they created an image of order amidst general chaos. From 1921 to 1923, the party grew rapidly. Its own newspaper, the Volkischer Beobachter, was founded, spreading Nazi ideas in a sensationalist manner among workers, merchants, and the military. Inflation, unemployment, and instability forced many to listen to radical slogans. Hitler was not the only active extremist. Paramilitary groups operated throughout the country. Bavarian separatists, monarchists, and others seeking to overthrow the government in Berlin. In Munich, the situation was tense. The police often condoned right-wing radicals and persecuted the left, allowing Hitler to act almost with impunity. In 1923, the situation escalated. French troops occupied the Ruhr region, the industrial heart of Germany. The government reacted passively. Inflation peaked. The mark was worth less than the paper it was printed on. Earnings devalued within hours. There was a food shortage. Many blamed politicians and the system. Hitler decided his moment had come. He planned to repeat the success of Benito Mussolini, who had organized the March on Rome a year earlier. Hitler's plan involved a coup starting in Munich with the aim of subsequently seizing Berlin. But he lacked sufficient resources and support. On November 8, 1923, Hitler and about 600 armed supporters stormed a beer hall where the Bavarian governor was speaking. They surrounded him, forced him to declare support, and took control of the venue. Thus began the Munich Putsch. The next day, the putsch participants took to the streets but were stopped by the police. A brief shootout occurred, in which 16 Nazis and 4 policemen were killed. Hitler was arrested. After his arrest, Adolf Hitler was sentenced to 5 years in prison, although he served only a few months in comfortable conditions. He used this time to write his book Mein Kampf, in which he outlined his political vision. In it, he expressed rejection of the parliamentary system, a desire for a powerful Germany, hatred of Jews and Marxists. In prison, Hitler concluded that the path of violent seizure of power was hopeless. Therefore, after his release in 1924, he changed his strategy, deciding to come to power by legal means, using existing institutions. He intended to make the NSDAP a legal political force, relying on voters' votes, not weapons. After the failed putsch, the party experienced a split. Some supporters advocated continuing the street struggle, others lost trust in the leader. But after his release, Hitler quickly restored absolute control over the NSDAP. To strengthen his power, he established strict internal discipline. No criticism of him was allowed. Only he determined the party's course. In 1925, the party was completely reorganized on a vertical principle with Hitler at the top. The SA stormtroopers, previously acting in a disorganized manner, were brought to order and subordinated to the party leadership as a tool of pressure and street action. At the same time, Mein Kampf was published, which over time became essential reading for understanding Nazi ideology. The book openly outlined plans to destroy Jews, conquer territories in the East, and eliminate the multi-party system. Joseph Goebbels, initially close to radical socialists, joined the NSDAP, impressed by Hitler's oratory. After a personal meeting, he became his devoted supporter. Goebbels began actively using propaganda as a key tool to attract youth, the unemployed, and veterans. Speeches, leaflets, and symbols became as important as physical violence. At the same time, Heinrich Himmler stood out for his discipline, fanaticism, and ability to manage internal structures. He took charge of a new, more loyal group, the SS Schutzstaffel, meaning protection squads. Created as an elite unit reporting directly to Hitler, the SS was characterized by greater cohesion, obedience, and radical views on racial purity than the SA. In the following years, the party grew slowly. In the 1924 elections, it gained only a few seats in parliament and then even lost some support. Many considered the movement exhausted, but Hitler did not give up. He maintained tight control and worked on expanding regional branches. A network of local activists was created to spread ideas in villages, factories, universities, and among veterans. The party relied on mass events to strengthen its image. Rallies with flags, torches, and marching music became the hallmark of the Nazis. Every action was calculated for strong emotional impact. Goebbels masterfully used propaganda. Unlike other parties, the Nazis offered not complex programs but simple solutions, designated enemies, promised strength, and presented a leader who said what people wanted to hear. In the 1928 elections, the NSDAP won only 12 seats but used this modest success as proof of its comeback. It was a signal that the party, though small, remained active. Meanwhile, the country's economic situation worsened, unemployment grew, and trust in traditional parties fell. Foreign aid under the Dawes Plan no longer ensured stability. Many economists warned that dependence on foreign credit was like a time bomb. In 1929, that bomb exploded. The crash of the New York Stock Exchange dragged down German banks. Within months, thousands of enterprises went bankrupt. Unemployment reached unprecedented levels. Queues for free food stretched down the street. Desperation was felt everywhere. It was at this moment that Hitler's ideas began to find mass resonance. While traditional parties engaged in fruitless debates, he positioned himself as the only decisive figure. In his speeches, he did not offer technical solutions but pointed to the guilty and promised that true Germans would reclaim their country. The crisis provided him with a perfect platform for growth. Goebbels intensified the propaganda campaign, using unemployment, poverty, and fear as main themes. Every leaflet depicted the suffering people, a rotten system, and a bright future only under Hitler's leadership. The party promised jobs, pride, security, and punishment for traitors. At the same time, business elites began to take a closer look at the movement. Although they did not share its violent or racist aspects, they saw in Hitler a force capable of stopping the communists. Major industrialists, such as Fritz Thyssen, began to finance the party. They wanted to end the chaos, get a strong figure who would stop strikes and protect private property. Hitler, in turn, softened some radical slogans to secure this support. The party also strengthened its organizational structure, creating departments by age, profession, and region. Youth and women were involved through special groups with ideological indoctrination. Courses, excursions, and holidays were organized, all with the aim of forming a collective identity. Every member became part of a disciplined machine. Local leaders received instructions directly from Munich, the center of party operations. The SA continued to expand. By 1929, its ranks numbered about 100,000, although the police monitored their actions. In many regions, they acted almost with impunity, beating opponents and disrupting other parties' events. In some cities, they became a parallel force that was feared, but that part of the population saw as a guarantor of order against chaos. The figure of Hitler acquired a cult status. He made all key decisions. No one could challenge his authority. Goebbels presented him as the Führer, the leader. His portrait dominated posters, his voice at rallies. The idea that only he could save the country was constantly repeated. The party's social base expanded. If initially it attracted mainly veterans and small traders, now it was joined by unemployed workers, ruined peasants, and youth without prospects. The party presented itself as a popular movement based on discipline and firm leadership. In the September 1930 elections, the NSDAP achieved a breakthrough, increasing its representation from 12 to 107 seats in parliament, and becoming the second largest faction after the Social Democrats. This showed that Hitler's speeches resonated with a significant part of the population. The consequences of the economic crisis and mass unemployment were directly reflected in the voting results. Goebbels led an intensive campaign. Cities were filled with posters, street actions were held, radio and loudspeakers were used. Hitler was portrayed as a strong leader capable of providing answers where others were inactive. Rallies were grand, with flags, uniforms, and coordinated chants. Every detail demonstrated order, strength, and determination. Factories closed, banks went bankrupt, poverty grew. Many Germans saw that the system was not working. Hitler did not offer detailed programs. He promised justice, punishment of the guilty, and the revival of Greater Germany. His message was simple and straightforward. The SS intensified activities, guarded party events, patrolled areas, and beat political opponents. The police, overburdened or indifferent, rarely intervened. In many settlements, stormtroopers acted completely freely. Their ranks grew with unemployed youth seeking belonging to something significant. Elites began to show interest. Some entrepreneurs and bankers saw the party as a tool against communism. Fritz Thyssen drew closer to the Nazis. Financial flows appeared. Confidential meetings and tacit agreements were held. For Hitler, it was important not to be constrained. The next task was to gain influence in the highest echelons of power. President Paul von Hindenburg felt no sympathy for Hitler, considering him a demagogue and an upstart without education, but understood that the country was on the brink of collapse. The elections showed that traditional parties could not form a stable government. From that moment on, the country was governed by presidential decrees. Chancellor Heinrich Brüning tried to cope with the crisis through harsh austerity and tax increases, which only worsened the recession. Dissatisfaction grew, his support dwindled, and the measures brought no visible results. Hitler used this weakness. In 1931, the NSDAP expanded its network of regional branches, the number of local party offices. Youth and women's organizations increased. Recruitment of new members was conducted daily. In rural areas, ideas were spread through radio and speeches by party agitators. In cities, parades became common. Goebbels was responsible for propaganda content. He wrote circulars, managed the party press, and spoke at mass events, presenting Hitler as a man of destiny, chosen to restore stability. At the same time, he pointed to the guilty, Marxists, Jews, foreigners, and traitors. The language of propaganda was aggressive, direct, without nuance. In the July 1932 elections, the party received over 13 million votes and 230 seats in parliament, becoming the largest political force. This result confirmed that the Nazis were no longer a marginal group. Hitler demanded the chancellorship for himself, but Hindenburg refused, appointing Franz von Papen as chancellor, who had no party of his own and ruled without a parliamentary majority. This decision was unpopular. Hitler did not accept defeat. He organized new rallies, spoke against the government, and mobilized supporters. Tension grew each week. Von Papen dissolved parliament and called new elections for November 1932. This time, the NSDAP lost a million votes but retained 196 seats, remaining the largest faction. The Communists also increased their representation, indicating sharp polarization of society. Hermann Göring was elected president of the parliament and used this position to block government initiatives. Von Papen resigned. His place was taken by Kurt von Schleicher, who tried to split the NSDAP by offering state posts to individual members. However, this strategy failed. Hitler maintained complete control over the organization and rejected all attempts at compromise. He wanted to become chancellor, otherwise nothing. Contacts between the Nazis and conservative circles became more frequent. Some entrepreneurs, military men, and politicians believed Hitler could be used if kept under control. They thought that by entering the government, they could limit his influence and steer him in the right direction. Hitler was seen as a tool for restoring order, not a real threat. On January 30, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Reich Chancellor by President Paul von Hindenburg. The ceremony took place at the president's residence. Franz von Papen and Otto Meissner were also present. The new government consisted mainly of conservatives. Wilhelm Frick headed the Ministry of the Interior. Hermann Göring received the post of Prussian Minister of the Interior. Franz von Papen became Vice Chancellor. Alfred Hugenberg became Minister of Economics. Only 3 cabinet members were members of the NSDAP. The others represented conservative parties and the state apparatus. Von Papen's idea was simple: use Hitler to suppress the labor movement and restore order, without giving him real power. The conservatives believed they could control him. Hitler's appointment did not meet serious resistance. The armed forces accepted the president's decision. Entrepreneurs expressed approval. Some even sent letters of support. Supporters in uniform gathered on the streets of Berlin. Torchlight processions took place. The pro-government press spoke of a new beginning. Goebbels prepared the first official announcement, speaking of the need for change, moral cleansing, and national revival. The tone was aggressive, with calls for unity under firm leadership. The text was reproduced throughout the country. From the first days, the new government acted quickly. Workers' demonstrations were banned. Left-wing publications were censored. In a number of regions, trade union activists were arrested. The police were ordered to cooperate with the stormtroopers. Göring coordinated these measures in Prussia, often bypassing parliament. Franz von Papen held meetings with entrepreneurs and diplomats, assuring them that the situation was under control and promising stability and investment. He claimed that Hitler had no majority of his own, and real power remained with the president and conservative ministers. Hitler convened cabinet meetings almost daily. He listened to opinions but set the pace and agenda himself, avoiding lengthy discussions. He demanded speed and loyalty, spoke in a firm tone, used pauses and direct eye contact. Frick and Göring obeyed without objection. Other ministers quickly realized the extent of his control. Hugenberg tried to slow down some decisions and proposed moderate economic measures, but Hitler ignored him, preferring to act through decrees and public statements. Goebbels disseminated information about decisions even before cabinet discussion, allowing the course to be set without consensus. The SS strengthened its presence in major cities, organized patrols, intimidated political opponents, occupied public buildings. Local authorities offered no resistance. Some officials sympathized with the party, others feared reprisals. A new propaganda ministry under Goebbels was created in Berlin, controlling posters, leaflets, radio broadcasts, and newspaper articles. Main themes: order, work, unity, and discipline. Technical details were avoided. Short phrases, vivid images, and recognizable symbols were used. In the first 2 weeks of rule, about 30 decrees were issued, most of which restricted civil rights, introduced censorship, or allowed arrests without a court order. The goal was clear: eliminate opposition, strengthen internal control, and consolidate power. Centrist and right-wing parties did not resist. Some hoped to restrain Hitler from within. Others relied on Hindenburg, expecting the president to use his powers to limit arbitrariness. No one acted decisively. Trade unions were disoriented, left-wing forces split. On February 13th, the dissolution of parliament and new elections for March 1933 were announced. Hitler sought an absolute majority and launched a massive campaign, traveling the country by plane and speaking at stadiums, squares, train stations, and factories. Rallies were held daily according to a rehearsed scenario. Goebbels organized night parades, concerts, and radio broadcasts. Cities were plastered with posters depicting Hitler as the national savior. He declared that the country faced a choice between chaos and order. His rhetoric was aggressive but effective. The response from the masses grew. On March 4th, Göring conducted mass arrests in Berlin. Hundreds of communists, socialists, and regime critics were detained. Left-wing offices were raided. On February 27th, the Reichstag building was set on fire. The police arrested a young Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe. Hitler and Göring used this incident as a pretext, claiming it was part of a large-scale conspiracy to seize power. The next day, an emergency decree was passed, suspending basic civil rights, allowing arrests without trial, and strengthening police powers. This decree became the first legal step towards establishing a dictatorship. The government acted without delay. Franz von Papen did not protest. Alfred Hugenberg supported the measure. Paul von Hindenburg signed the decree without objection. Only a few judges expressed doubts, but no one listened. Power quickly concentrated in Hitler's hands, who ceased to be just a chancellor and gained control over the state apparatus of coercion. Entrepreneurs provided financial support for the March elections, raised funds, organized events, and placed advertisements in favor of the NSDAP. They set no conditions but wanted stability and guarantees against communism. Hitler promised both. Elections were held on March 5, 1933. Hitler's party sought an absolute majority to fully control parliament. In the campaign atmosphere, the Reichstag fire allowed the application of the emergency decree suspending civil rights. Communists were brutally persecuted. Many candidates were barred from participation. Others could not speak publicly. On election day, streets were patrolled by stormtroopers and police. Official newspapers claimed that only a complete Nazi victory would bring stability. Party members actively agitated and monitored the voting. The results did not meet expectations. The NSDAP received 43% of the vote, the best result to date, but insufficient for control of parliament. However, with the support of Alfred Hugenberg's nationalists, the Nazis were able to form a simple majority. Communists were excluded from parliament based on the decree, changing the distribution of seats. The regime began to rebuild the system. On March 21st, a solemn ceremony was held in Potsdam in the Church of the Prussian Kings. Paul von Hindenburg appeared in full dress uniform. Hitler in a dark suit bowed to the president. This image was reproduced on thousands of posters and was meant to symbolize the unity of old. In New Germany, 2 days later, on March 23rd, Parliament met to pass a law that radically changed the rules of the game. The so-called Enabling Act Ermächtigungsgesetz allowed the cabinet to enact laws. Without parliamentary participation, a 2/3 majority was required for its passage. The Social Democrats voted against the rest for. The Communists were not present. Many were arrested, others were in hiding or had fled abroad. The President of the Parliament allowed their seats to be counted for the quorum, a legally questionable procedure. The law was passed without problems. From that moment on, the government could act without parliamentary control. Adolf Hitler wasted no time. In April, Jewish officials were dismissed from the civil service. Opposition publications were closed. Regional governments were placed under supervision. In each state, commissioners with broad powers were appointed. The country was turning into a centralized structure. Decisions were made in Berlin. May 1st was declared National Labor Day. Parades and mass events were held. Trade union leaders were invited as a sign of goodwill. But the next day, their offices were seized by stormtroopers, and they themselves were arrested. Trade union bank accounts were transferred to the control of a new state body. The German Labor Front was created, the only permitted organization representing workers. Its leader, Robert Ley, reported directly to the Chancellor. Workers lost the right to collective bargaining and strikes. Any protest was considered sabotage. Propaganda explained these measures as necessary for national unity. In June, the remaining political parties were banned. Some dissolved themselves, others were closed by decree. Opposition party offices were confiscated, leaders were under surveillance. Only one party remained permitted in the country, the NSDAP. Youth organizations were also integrated. The German youth movement became part of the party's youth organization. Sports, camps, and cultural events were under direct control. Greetings and songs were standardized. The goal was to raise a new generation in the spirit of discipline and obedience. The power structure was quickly strengthened. In each region, a party leader was appointed. In each city, a local leader. In each district, someone responsible for the bloc. It was a hierarchical network where everyone obeyed the supreme leader. Instructions were passed from top to bottom. Each level controlled the one below. The police were purged. Employees loyal to the Republic were dismissed. Promotions went to those who supported the new line. Special units were created, trained in interrogation methods, crowd control, and quick arrest. Every week, new prisoners arrived in prisons. The Ministry of the Interior issued new rules, compiled lists of banned authors, dissolved public associations, and rewrote textbooks. Inspectors visited schools, libraries, and community centers. Any traces of opposition were eliminated. A unified image of the country was promoted. Images of Adolf Hitler appeared on portraits, banknotes, stamps, and books and albums. He was presented as a strong leader, protector of the people and fatherland. Radio broadcast his speeches live. Cinemas began screenings with official newsreels. Newspapers were brought under control. Editors-in-chief received instructions from Berlin. Headlines, illustrations, and commentaries were checked. Independent publications were closed or absorbed. Every article had to reflect the official point of view. Radio stations were required to broadcast propaganda material daily. Joseph Goebbels, as Minister of Propaganda, controlled all content reaching the population, checked scripts, oversaw film shoots, prepared campaigns. The media organized thematic weeks. Every message was to reinforce a certain idea. The new state restored order, the internal enemy. Obedience is duty. Universities were checked by party commissars. Teachers expressing disagreement were dismissed. Promotions went to those demonstrating loyalty. Curricula were adjusted. History was taught from one official point of view. School children used textbooks revised by central authorities. The judicial system was restructured. Loyal judges were appointed. Norms hindering the execution of decrees were repealed. Special courts were created to hear cases of treason, sabotage, and hostile propaganda. Trials were quick, sentences immediate, the right to full defense and appeal limited. The political police were expanded. The Central Intelligence Directorate was created. New agents were trained, informant networks organized. In each district, there were responsible persons. Letters were checked, telephone calls could be tapped. Arrests were made without a warrant. Prisons were filled with political prisoners. Teachers had to take an oath of loyalty. School principals reported suspicious activity. School songs were replaced. Maps showed new geography. Permitted biographies were limited to approved personalities. Words, symbols, and even colors were standardized. Culture was under strict control. Doctors had to join party organizations. Medical care was regulated by the state. Detailed data on patients were collected, which could later be used for selective measures. Private clinics were controlled, state hospitals under supervision. Some scientific research was banned, others encouraged. Artists were summoned to meetings where they were told that every work must serve the people. Exhibitions were controlled, private galleries subjected to sudden inspections. Unsuitable works were confiscated. Traveling exhibitions were organized to promote the new style. Sculptors, painters, and musicians had to adapt to the regime's demands. Pressure was exerted on churches to submit. A national church federation was created under the control of approved leaders. Some clergy agreed, others resisted. They were denied access to media and resources. Licenses were revoked, sermons checked, any criticism punished. An opposition group formed within the clergy. Laws were revised, indicating ethnic origin became mandatory. New categories appeared in documents. Marriages were evaluated by local commissioners. Certificates were issued only to those meeting certain criteria. Couples received official recommendations. Weddings were conducted according to party rituals. Street names were changed. Thousands of signs were updated. Squares were renamed in honor of those who fell for the movement. Old monuments were replaced by busts of the new leader. Symbols of the past were removed, train stations renamed, national holidays redefined. Dates associated with the previous republic were canceled, new celebrations introduced. Every party anniversary was marked by parades, singing, collective oaths, and school events. Leaflets with instructions were distributed. Families were to hang flags. Civil servants underwent mandatory courses. Their behavior was evaluated, family biographies checked, participation in party events required. Attendance at meetings was monitored. Every deviation was recorded, dossiers compiled. Promotion depended on loyalty. Dismissals followed immediately at the slightest suspicion. Enterprises became part of the national labor system. Owners signed agreements, general rules applied. Hanging portraits of leaders in workshops was mandatory. Instructions came from the Ministry of Labor. Voluntary contributions to patriotic funds were required. Workers were evaluated on their civic behavior as well. Working-class neighborhoods were decorated with slogans, collective games organized. Leaflets were distributed door to door. The internal purge, Night of the Long Knives. Adolf Hitler had been concentrating power for over a year, but still faced internal obstacles. One of them was Ernst Röhm, head of the SA, the paramilitary organization that outnumbered the regular army. Röhm wanted the SA to become the basis of the new army, which would secure him a key place in power. The SA, previously useful for intimidating opponents, became a problem for Hitler. The military leadership was against turning street militia into a replacement for the army. The generals distrusted Rem, his egalitarian rhetoric, and his demand for a second revolution. Hitler understood this, and tension grew. In June 1934, Adolf Hitler decided to strike. He used an official trip as cover to prepare the operation. Himmler and Göring were informed and supported the plan. The SS and Gestapo received lists of people to be arrested or eliminated. On the night of June 30th, Hitler arrived in Bad Wiessee, where Rem was with other Saal leaders. He personally arrested his former ally. Soon over 100 people were detained across the country. Some were shot on the spot. In Berlin, SS units and security services carried out arrests and executions. Former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher was shot at home along with his wife. Gregor Strasser, one of the party's founders, was also killed without trial. The list included both real opponents and potential enemies. In Stadelheim prison, Ernst Rem was offered to shoot himself, but he refused. Then two SS men entered his cell and killed him. Hitler did not want to leave symbols of resistance alive. The operation continued until July 2nd. Over these 3 days, the Saal was decapitated and stripped of influence. Surviving officers were removed from power. The structure, once symbolizing street struggle, became just a memory. The SS strengthened its position and autonomy. The regular army welcomed what had happened. The generals, fearing competition from Rem's militia, saw Hitler's actions as a gesture in their favor. A few days later, they took a personal oath of loyalty not to the state or institution, but to Hitler personally. This was a decisive step towards creating a regime completely subordinated to his person. On July 13th, Adolf Hitler addressed the parliament. He was in uniform, spoke sternly and directly, explaining that he had intervened to stop betrayal. He referred to documents collected by the Gestapo. Applause was immediate. No deputy dared to object. The same day, the Ministry of Justice published a retroactive law declaring all actions from June 30th to July 2nd lawful measures to protect the state. This text turned murder into official actions. The message was clear. Any decision of the Führer stood above traditional law. The propaganda machine worked at full capacity. Goebbels ordered all newspapers to publish the same headline: Hitler acts to save Germany. Radio stations broadcast the official version of events for hours. Leaflets were distributed, rallies organized, a film made. Everything was aimed at strengthening the image of the leader who restored order with a firm hand. The Saal was crushed, its barracks closed or transferred to other departments. Thousands of members lost status and privileges. Most returned to civilian life. The structure, once symbolizing street struggle, became just a memory. The SS took on a new role. Heinrich Himmler reorganized them as an autonomous force with its own functions and direct access to the Führer. They became the apparatus of internal security with camps, intelligence, and operational powers. The loyalty of SS members was absolute. The black uniform replaced this brown uniform as a symbol of real power within the regime. The political purge was a turning point. No group within the party dared to stand out anymore. Internal disagreements were resolved without negotiations. Hitler made it clear that unity was achieved through exclusion, not dialogue. From then on, meetings became monologues, speeches became orders, congresses became parades. The army also changed. Having received guarantees that the parallel militia was destroyed, the generals signed a personal pact of loyalty. This oath became mandatory for every officer and soldier. Obedience was not to the flag or institution, but directly to the Führer. The climate in government institutions changed. Departments, courts, ministries, and universities adopted a new tone. Portraits were replaced, curricula adjusted, loyalists promoted, critics excluded. Rumors were enough to open a dossier. Positions were distributed based on personal loyalty, not competence. Efficiency gave way to obedience. The regime's conservative allies understood the message. Entrepreneurs, religious leaders, and regional heads began to imitate the style. Discipline was placed above opinion. Committees were replaced by vertical orders. Decisions were concentrated in a narrow circle. Information was centralized in Berlin. Provinces set reports without asking questions within the party. The middle level adopted a new position. Political calculation changed. It was no longer enough just to be a member. One had to anticipate the leader's wishes, decipher signals, and show initiative and submission. Loyalty became demonstrative, silence too. No one wanted to appear indifferent. Opportunism became a defense mechanism. The events of late June left a deep psychological mark. Witnesses avoided conversation. Victims' families received threats demanding silence. In many cases, bodies were not returned. Public funerals or mourning were forbidden. Even among regime supporters, fear became constant. Abroad, the news was met with alarm. Some governments sent diplomatic protests. Others recalled military attaches. The international press described what happened as an authoritarian turn. However, within Germany, the reaction was minimal. Terror acted as cement. Passivity as a survival strategy. Suppression mechanisms ceased to be an exception. They became legitimate means. The price for betrayal, real or imagined, was death without trial. Moral guidelines were defined from above. The phrase "Night of the Long Knives" was secretly repeated as a warning. Among party cadres, it served as a code for dangerous situations. In the administration, it was synonymous with purge. On the streets, a legend without details, but everyone understood its meaning. Anyone who disobeyed could disappear within hours. This event also set the boundaries of the permissible. If Hitler was willing to eliminate his longtime comrades, no one could feel safe. Calculation was based not on ideology, but on personal loyalty. Leadership within the regime became a tightrope walk. Rise meant risk. Fall was final. From then on, decisions no longer required consensus. A signal from the chancellery was enough to change policy, close an institution, or replace an entire cabinet. Capital and the Reich, the alliance with entrepreneurs. After eliminating Ernst Röhm and consolidating control over the army, Adolf Hitler focused on securing the support of economic elites. Since coming to power, business leaders had watched with interest the regime's suppression of trade unions, anti-communist rhetoric, and promises of order. However, there remained doubts regarding the government's specific economic plans. In 1934, Hitler began to dispel them. One of the first steps was assurances to major industrialists of the inviolability of private property, investments, and entrepreneurial freedom. Expropriations, characteristic of other radical movements, were excluded. Meetings were held with key figures such as Gustav Krupp and Fritz Thyssen. The message was clear. The state wanted cooperation, not interference. At the same time, the Nazis finally liquidated independent trade unions. The previous structure of worker representation was replaced by the German Labor Front under the leadership of Robert Ley. This organization was to reconcile the interests of workers with the interests of the regime. Strikes were banned, wages set without collective bargaining. Industry welcomed such stability in labor relations. The state began large-scale public construction projects. Autobahns, bridges, and canals became showcases of the regime. These initiatives not only created jobs but also provided orders for loyal companies. The allocation of projects increasingly depended on proximity to power. Loyal firms received priority. Reluctant ones were excluded. By 1935, heavy industry felt the effects of rearmament policy. Orders for steel, coal, and machinery increased. Arms factories received new contracts. Authorities issued them without tenders, with advance payment and confidentiality conditions. Private investments grew along with military spending. Banks also found opportunities for growth. Institutions like Deutsche Bank facilitated lending to defense industries. Operations were guaranteed by the state, which assumed risks in exchange for loyalty. Profits were high, control minimal. The Ministry of Economics under Hjalmar Schacht pursued flexible monetary policy. and conducted direct negotiations with leading business associations. Hitler delegated economic management to ministers but closely monitored political aspects. He held private meetings with key entrepreneurs, offering guarantees of continuity in exchange for commitment to regime goals. This informal pact was unambiguous: financial support in exchange for protection and opportunities for expansion. Party donations increased. Many companies created secret funds to finance the NSDAP. Rearmament became the basis of this alliance. Industries related to military production became pillars of the system. Aircraft, tank, and weapons factories expanded capacity. Jobs masked the massive redirection of resources to military needs. Unemployment decreased, but statistics were falsified. Women, Jews, and forced laborers were not counted. Hitler strengthened ideological control over the economy. The leadership of trade chambers, unions, and industry associations was replaced by party members. Decisions were made not only on economic but also political criteria. Obedience became a condition for receiving orders, licenses, or access to foreign currency. Industrial exhibitions organized by the regime became propaganda showcases, presented as proof of economic revival. However, behind this was a network of interdependence between political power and large corporations. Every project served a dual purpose: modernization and strengthening control. The economy was shaped according to the party's needs. Any forms of trade union opposition were eliminated, external competition limited, allies given priority. The system left no room for independence. Decisions came from above, and companies' room for maneuver depended on closeness to the party. At the same time, economic policy developed towards full-scale rearmament. The Office of the Four-Year Plan, established in 1936, identified key industries: steel, rubber, synthetic fuel, aluminum, and armaments. Import substitution programs were developed, joint enterprises created to develop own technologies. Every new factory was linked to military efforts, even if presented as industrial progress. The regime also encouraged the involvement of youth in the controlled economy. Technical training programs linked to state or allied enterprises were created. Indoctrination began at school and continued in workshops of the German labor front. Discipline, obedience, and submission were the basis of the model. In rural areas, cooperatives were reorganized. Any forms of self-government were abolished. A hierarchical structure introduced where party delegates decided on resource distribution. Agricultural prices were set by authorities. Surpluses served as a strategic reserve. Property remained private, but its use was subordinated to state goals. The use of forced labor began to be organized at this stage. Although the mass forced labor system, known later, did not yet exist, experiments were already being conducted using prison and concentration camp inmates. Authorities allocated contingents of prisoner workers to certain entrepreneurs under opaque conditions. This was a trial of what was to come in the future. On the international level, the regime tried to maintain the image of a recovering country. Diplomatic visits included tours of model factories, modern stadiums, and autobahns. Unemployment data was embellished, financial reports adjusted to show balance. The goal was to attract foreign capital, without revealing the true military orientation of the economy. The economic elite adapted, some out of pragmatism, others out of conviction. Profits were high, and room for maneuver depended on proximity to power. Many companies created their own channels of communication with party hierarchies, offering donations, services, and other favors. The connection was direct, functional, and unchecked. By the end of 1936, the German economy was already operating according to a logic completely subordinated to the political project. There was no room for initiatives not aligned with regime goals. The economic bureaucracy functioned as an ideological filter. Decisions were made at the top of the party hierarchy and implemented vertically.
The corporate sector was integrated into this structure. Racial exclusion and the Nuremberg laws. In September 1935, at the party rally in Nuremberg, Adolf Hitler presented a series of decrees that formalized the legal exclusion of Jews from German society. These provisions, known as the Nuremberg Laws, were quickly developed by the Ministry of the Interior and codified what had already been de facto in effect for about 2 years. The first law defined who was considered a Jew based on genealogical, not religious, criteria. A person with 3 or more Jewish grandparents was classified as a Jew regardless of faith or cultural identity. Having 2 Jewish ancestors placed a person in the category of Mischling of the first degree. The system created a racial hierarchy, belonging determined by descent and immutable. The second law stripped Jews of citizenship. They ceased to be citizens of the Reich, retaining only the status of subjects without political rights. This meant exclusion from any representation, prohibition from civil service, teaching, or administrative positions, loss of voting rights and the right to be elected. The legal structure erased their belonging to the German political body. The third provision, the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, prohibited marriages and sexual relations between Jews and German citizens. Any intimate contact was considered a biological threat to the purity of the people. Existing mixed couples were not allowed to live together. Human contact was criminalized. The state apparatus began implementing the new decrees. Local party bureaus, commissariats, schools, and courts received clear instructions. Racial registries were created. Forms required indication of origin. Families had to check genealogies. Errors or forgeries were severely punished. Officials became agents of ethnic classification. Special racial courts were created and quickly began work. Their task was to establish the racial affiliation of the accused based on birth certificates, baptismal records, and witness testimony. People underwent lengthy and humiliating procedures. Some tried to prove their non-Jewish origin. Others were reported by neighbors, former partners, or competitors. Newspapers published exemplary cases reporting dismissed teachers, suspended doctors, and entrepreneurs deprived of business. Names were published for intimidating purposes. The message was clear: there is no place for people with Jewish blood. The laws were applied in rural and remote areas as well. Surveillance was ubiquitous, spying encouraged. Fear of denunciation forced the rupture of family and friendly ties. The police acted immediately. Raids were conducted in cafes, cinemas, parks. Officials checked the documents of those present. Discovered mixed couples were separated and arrested. Suspicion of relations with Jews could destroy a career or family. The number of denunciations motivated by jealousy, revenge, or personal gain sharply increased. The official press intensified the racist message. Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda promoted campaigns glorifying German purity. Youth magazines showed ideal Aryan families. Films contained warnings about the danger of mixing. In schools, teachers taught racial biology as part of the curriculum. Skull measurements, facial feature analysis, and origin studies were conducted. Enterprises joined the process. Many began dismissing Jewish employees without formal grounds. Others hung signs, "Jews not admitted." Public transport became segregated. Universities refused enrollment to non-Aryan students. In hospitals, Jewish doctors were replaced by specialists connected to the party. Professional unions excluded members marked as Jews. In private life, the consequences were catastrophic. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years stopped communicating. Invitations disappeared. Shops refused to serve regular customers. Social isolation went hand in hand with legal exclusion. Children were bullied in schools. Families found themselves isolated. Cases of forced resettlement increased. Many sought emigration opportunities, but bureaucratic barriers made it increasingly difficult. Party leaders celebrated the effectiveness of the measures, speaking of cleansing the national organism. Figures were presented: number of dissolved marriages, stripped citizenships, jobs redistributed among party members. The policy of exclusion ceased to be informal. It was codified, regulated, and enforced by state structures. Foreign governments watched with alarm. Some sent protests, but without practical consequences. Diplomatic delegations received reports, but sanctions were not imposed. The great powers preferred to maintain European stability. Foreign entrepreneurs continued to sign contracts. The regime realized it could act with impunity. By the summer of 1936, the system of racial exclusion was fully consolidated. The Nuremberg laws turned everyday discrimination into a structured, mass, and effective state doctrine. The legal, police, and social apparatus was already working. The next step would be the physical expulsion of the excluded and diplomatic conquest of Central Europe. Adolf Hitler had long tested the limits of the permissible without fearing consequences. In March 1936, he made a decision that directly challenged the post-war order, sending German troops into the Rhineland. This region, demilitarized by the Treaty of Versailles, was key to the balance of power in Western Europe. Its reoccupation directly violated international agreements. Nevertheless, soldiers crossed the Rhine without resistance. Inside Germany, this step was met as a triumph. Hitler had restored sovereignty without shedding blood. The reoccupation of the Rhineland was more than a symbolic act. Hitler was testing the willingness of the great powers for military confrontation. Convinced they would not intervene, he realized he had room to maneuver and accelerated his plans. The next target was Austria. For years, nationalist groups in Austria, sympathetic to Nazism, demanded unification with Germany. Hitler, born in Austria, shared this aspiration. In February 1938, he put pressure on Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg, demanding greater participation of Nazis in the state. Schuschnigg reluctantly agreed, but simultaneously announced a referendum on independence. Hitler did not wait for the results. On March 11th, he ordered troops into Austria. The next day, German soldiers crossed the border without a single shot. They were met by crowds with flags and greetings. Upon arrival in Vienna, Hitler proclaimed the Anschluss, the complete incorporation of Austria into the Third Reich. The Allies again condemned the annexation, but again did nothing. The consequences were immediate. Thousands of opponents arrested. Jews of Austria began to be persecuted. The Nuremberg laws came into force. Nazi propaganda spread images of popular jubilation, justifying the operation as a legitimate reunification. Hitler appeared on the streets of Vienna as a revered leader. His influence expanded without real obstructions. After this success, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia. In the west of the country was the Sudetenland, populated by a significant German-speaking minority. The Nazi regime claimed this population was discriminated and demanded its inclusion in the Reich. Throughout 1938, diplomatic pressure intensified. Pro-Nazi groups within the Sudetenland fueled tension. The Czechoslovak government refused to yield, counting on military support from France and having an agreement with the Soviet Union. But neither Paris nor London wanted a new conflict. In September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Premier Edward Dallier came to Munich for direct negotiations with Hitler. The dictator demanded the immediate transfer of the Sudetenland. At dawn of September 30th, the powers signed an agreement allowing Germany to annex the territory without resistance. Czechoslovakia, not invited to the negotiations, was forced to agree. Returning to London, Chamberlain declared he had secured peace for our time. In Berlin, Hitler regarded this as a complete victory. The annexation of the Sudetenland reinforced the perception that the Third Reich could expand without a single shot. Hitler had managed to change borders through pressure, threats, and aggressive diplomacy. Each step weakened neighbors and strengthened his authority within the country. The army, entrepreneurs, and the population celebrated the growth of the country without the losses of open war. With the Sudetenland under German control, Czech industry, defensive lines, and a significant part of arms production fell into Nazi hands. Hitler did not need a full-scale invasion to gain strategic advantage. The following year, Czechoslovakia would be completely liquidated. In 3 years, the Third Reich had managed to expand territorially without engaging in major combat. The international community yielded each time Hitler raised the stakes. The lessons of the Rhineland, Austria, and the Sudetenland showed that Hitler advanced while the powers hesitated. European balance was disrupted without formal battles, through military parades, public...
Poland under attack. The beginning of the war. By early 1939, Adolf Hitler had already incorporated the Rhineland, Austria, and the Sudetenland into the Third Reich without firing a shot. However, his ambitions extended further. He targeted Poland, a country that had regained independence after World War I and had access to the sea through the so-called Polish Corridor, a strip of land separating East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The Nazi regime began an intensive propaganda campaign portraying Poland as a threat. It spoke of alleged oppression of the German minority on Polish territory. Moreover, Hitler demanded control over the free city of Danzig, Gdansk, and territorial connection between Germany and East Prussia. Polish authorities refused to yield, understanding that any concession would be followed by new demands. In March 1939, Hitler publicly violated the Munich Agreement by occupying the remainder of Czechoslovakia, showing that his word had no diplomatic value. In light of this advance, London and Paris declared guarantees of Poland's independence. If Germany attacked, there would be war. Hitler did not stop. In August, his diplomats secretly negotiated with the Soviet Union. On August 23, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed. Officially a non-aggression treaty, its secret protocols provided for the division of Eastern Europe. Germany would get Western Poland, the USSR the eastern part, and the Baltic states. With this pact, Hitler gained freedom of action. On the night of September 1, 1939, German troops crossed the Polish border. The invasion was carried out using a coordinated strategy combining ground forces, tank divisions, and air attacks. This was the first demonstration of blitzkrieg, lightning war. Polish forces, despite bravery, could not stop the advance. The Luftwaffe bombed roads, stations, and cities. Warsaw came under air attack from the first days. German troops advanced rapidly, disrupting communication lines and sowing chaos. Images of tank columns passing through Polish villages marked a new type of conflict, fast, brutal, and relentless. On September 3rd, Great Britain and France kept their promise and declared war on Germany. However, for several weeks, they did not conduct active offensive operations. The so-called phony war began. Meanwhile, Poland fought alone. On September 17th, the Soviet Union, taking advantage of the situation, invaded Poland from the east. The country was caught between two powers that had agreed on its partition. Within a month, the Polish state ceased to exist as a sovereign entity. Warsaw fell on September 28th. Authorities were arrested, deported, or destroyed. Territories occupied by Germany came under military administration, the eastern part under Soviet control. Millions of civilians found themselves in the epicenter of conflict. Executions, internment camps, and deportations began immediately. The attack on Poland became the final turning point. World War II became a reality. Hitler's strategy of seizing territory without direct resistance ended. Now he would face armed and determined opponents. However, he was confident in his military superiority. The Nazi regime counted on a short, crushing, and victorious war. The invasion of Poland also revealed the true nature of the Nazi project. It was not just about redrawing borders. German authorities immediately began the systematic destruction of political leaders, intellectuals, teachers, priests, and any figure representing Polish national identity. This was the beginning of a policy of brutal occupation and ethnic restructuring that would later spread to all conquered territories. The operation concluded with the consolidation of Adolf Hitler's power over the military and political apparatus of the Reich. The Wehrmacht had proven its effectiveness. The Gestapo expanded its network in occupied territories. The SS began applying methods of control and repression on a large scale. Within days, the logic of terror was established as a form of rule in the East. For millions of Europeans, September 1, 1939 marked the beginning of a new phase of suffering, occupation, and death. What began as an operation to reclaim a port city escalated into a global war that forever changed the fate of the continent. Expansion of the war and establishment of the new order. After the rapid defeat of Poland, Adolf Hitler and his military command expected that Great Britain and France, faced with the fact, would negotiate. However, the Western powers, although they did not start active offensive operations, the so-called phony war, did not withdraw the declaration of war. This forced Hitler to act in the West. In the spring of 1940, German troops began a large-scale offensive, bypassing the powerful French Maginot Line from the north. The Blitzkrieg strategy again proved effective. Denmark and Norway were occupied. Then in May-June, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg fell. The main thrust of the Wehrmacht through the Ardennes, considered impassable, was a complete surprise to the Allies. The British Expeditionary Force was encircled at Dunkirk and evacuated with heavy losses. On June 14th, German troops entered Paris without a fight, and on June 22nd, France signed a humiliating armistice in the Compiègne forest, in the very railway car where the 1918 armistice with Germany had been concluded. The victory in the West, achieved in the matter of weeks, seemed a complete triumph for Hitler. Most of Western and Northern Europe was under the control of the Third Reich or its satellites. The British Isles remained the last major opponent in Europe. In the summer of 1940, the Battle of Britain began, a massive air campaign aimed at gaining air superiority and preparing for a possible invasion, Operation Sea Lion. However, the stubborn resistance of the British Royal Air Force, RAF, led to significant losses for the Luftwaffe. Hitler, irritated by delays and increasingly obsessed with the idea of attacking the Soviet Union, postponed and then effectively canceled the invasion of Great Britain in October 1940. The Führer's attention turned to the Balkans and the Mediterranean. In April 1941, German troops invaded Yugoslavia and Greece to secure the southern flank for the planned invasion of the USSR and help his ally Benito Mussolini, whose troops were failing. These campaigns were also quick and successful. However, Hitler's main strategic goal from the beginning, as outlined in Mein Kampf, was the East, living space, Lebensraum, at the expense of Slavic peoples. The pact with the USSR in 1939 was only a temporary tactical ploy. Already in December 1940, Directive Barbarossa was approved, the plan for a lightning war against the Soviet Union.
Invasion of the Soviet Union and the turning point of the war. On June 22, 1941, violating the Non-Aggression Pact, a multi-million-strong German army invaded Soviet territory along the entire border from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The initial phase of the operation was catastrophic for the Red Army. Surprise, superiority in tactics and mobility of the Wehrmacht led to the encirclement and defeat of large Soviet groupings, the capture of hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and rapid advance deep into the country. Hitler and his generals were confident that the USSR would collapse before winter, like France. However, as they advanced towards Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev, German troops encountered fierce resistance, growing logistical problems, and vast spaces.
Operation Typhoon, the offensive on Moscow in the autumn of 1941, was halted on the outskirts of the capital by the defenders' tenacity and early frosts. The Red Army's counteroffensive in December 1941 pushed German troops back from Moscow and for the first time in the war inflicted a major defeat on the Wehrmacht. The myth of the invincibility of the German war machine was dispelled. The failure of blitzkrieg in the East marked a fundamental turning point in the war. The war became a protracted war of attrition for which Germany, despite captured territories, was poorly prepared. Its economy, although switched to a war footing, could not match the production potential of the combined forces of the anti-Hitler coalition, especially after the United States entered the war in December 1941. Genocide policy and new order in occupied territories. Parallel to military campaigns, the Nazi regime began implementing its ideological program in conquered lands. The administration of occupied territories of Eastern Europe and the USSR was transferred to Reichskommissariats, where a brutal occupation regime was established. The local population was viewed as a source of slave labor and subject to partial destruction, partial Germanization regarding racially acceptable elements. Policies of starvation, mass shootings, and deportations became commonplace. The most monstrous manifestation of Nazi ideology was the Holocaust, the systematic destruction of the Jewish population of Europe. After the invasion of Poland, Jews were herded into ghettos. With the start of the war against the USSR, Special Einsatzgruppen, operating behind the advancing army, carried out mass shootings of Jews, Roma, communists, and other undesirable elements. By the end of 1941, the final solution to the Jewish question was adopted: the transition to systematic extermination in death camps equipped with gas chambers and crematoria, Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, and others. Millions of people were killed in this industrial genocide. In the Reich itself and occupied countries, an extensive network of concentration camps served not only for destruction, but also for the exploitation of slave labor for the benefit of German war industry. Large conglomerates such as IG Farben, Siemens, Krupp actively used prisoner labor, which became the logical culmination of the alliance between the Nazi state and big business. Crisis and Retreat, 1942–1944. Despite the defeat at Moscow, in the summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht launched a new major offensive on the southern sector of the Soviet-German front, aiming to seize the oil fields of the Caucasus and cut the Volga transport artery. This campaign culminated in the colossal Battle of Stalingrad, which by February 1943 ended with the encirclement and surrender of the 6th German Army. The loss of an entire army was an unprecedented military and psychological blow for Germany. In the summer of 1943, the Wehrmacht's attempt to regain the initiative at the Battle of Kursk, Operation Citadel, failed. Soviet troops seized the strategic initiative and did not relinquish it until the end of the war. On the Eastern Front, the irreversible retreat of the Wehrmacht began. On other fronts, the situation also deteriorated. In North Africa, German-Italian forces under Rommel were defeated by the British at El Alamein in the autumn of 1942. Soon after, the Anglo-American landing in Morocco and Algeria, Operation Torch, led to the complete defeat of Axis forces in Africa by May 1943. In the summer of 1943, the Allies landed in Sicily, leading to the fall of Benito Mussolini's regime. Although Germany occupied northern Italy and continued fierce fighting there, a new heavy front opened for the Reich. German cities were subjected to increasingly destructive bombing by Anglo-American aviation. The economy, operating at its limit, began to falter due to shortages of raw materials and labor. Mobilization became total. Women, teenagers, and foreign workers were drawn into factories. The July 20 plot and total mobilization. Discontent within Germany, especially among part of the aristocratic officer corps and conservative circles disillusioned with the course of the war and the inhumanity of the regime, was growing. Its peak was the attempted coup on July 20, 1944. Colonel Klaus Schenk von Stauffenberg planted a bomb at the Führer's headquarters, the Wolf's Lair. Hitler survived, and the plot was brutally suppressed. Mass arrests and executions of thousands of suspects followed, among many prominent military and state figures. The repression strengthened Hitler's power in the last year of the war, paralyzing any potential opposition. After the plot's failure, the regime tightened to the limit. Total war was declared. Goebbels, appointed plenipotentiary for total war mobilization, called for final sacrifices. The Volkssturm, a people's militia conscripting old men and teenagers, was to defend the Reich. The economy and society were subordinate to one goal: continuing the hopeless struggle. In June 1944, the long-awaited Second Front in Western Europe opened, the massive Allied landing in Normandy, Operation Overlord. Despite fierce resistance, German troops were forced to retreat under pressure from superior forces. In the east, Soviet armies began a series of grand offensive operations, Bagration, Vistula-Oder, East Prussian, as a result of which Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Prussia were liberated, and they advanced to the outskirts of Berlin. By early 1945, Germany was fighting on its own territory on two fronts. Western allies crossed the Rhine, Soviet troops stood on the Oder. Bombing turned cities into ruins, industrial production paralyzed, the transport system destroyed. Millions of refugees moved west, fleeing the advancing Red Army. In his underground bunker in Berlin, Adolf Hitler, whose physical and mental condition was deteriorating, gave orders to non-existent armies, blaming the generals and the entire German people for betrayal, whom in his opinion had proven unworthy of their Führer. On April 16, 1945, the Soviet Berlin Strategic Offensive Operation began. After fierce street fighting, on April 30th, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. On May 2nd, the Berlin garrison capitulated. On May 7th in Reims, and then on May 8th in Karlshorst, Berlin, the German High Command signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender. The war in Europe was over. The Third Reich, proclaimed to last 1,000 years, lasted 12 years and left behind a continent in ruins, tens of millions dead, and an indelible trauma in human history. Outcomes and consequences. The rise and fall of the Third Reich were the result of a unique combination of historical circumstances: national humiliation after Versailles, economic upheavals, weakness of the Weimar Republic's democratic institutions, fears of conservative elites, and mass appeal to a radical simple ideology in a crisis. The personal role of Adolf Hitler as a charismatic demagogue who managed to unite disparate forces of the discontented and subject them to his will was key. Having come to power by legal means, the regime quickly destroyed the rule of law, establishing a totalitarian dictatorship based on terror, propaganda, and a cult of personality. Its domestic policy was followed by aggressive expansionism that plunged the world into the bloodiest war in history. The defeat of Nazism led to the collapse of the regime, the occupation and division of Germany, and the establishment of a new world order. The crimes of the Third Reich, the Holocaust, wars of extermination, the monstrous scale of violence became a warning for future generations about the dangers of totalitarianism, racial hatred, and